With King George III's refusal to accept the Olive Branch petition, um, this war has moved from revolution of ideas into sort of a clear war. And there is going to be an issue for General Thomas Gage. He is the military general, sort of the military commander of Boston. And his big issue is all of the militiamen who are in Massachusetts. They are technically not breaking any laws. However, they are sort of preparing, they are training to eventually fight the British Army. But General Gage, the British general, has all of these training soldiers around him, but can't fight them in terms of English law because they are English citizens. And the militia knows this. The Continental Congress knows this. So they have a few groups of men who go to Fort Ticonderoga. If you see Fort Ticonderoga here, it is in upstate New York today. And it had a ton of weapons, lots and lots of cannons, and 2 men are sent to retrieve those cannons for the American cause. We have Benedict Arnold, the American, as well as Ethan Allen. And they are sent to get the cannons at Fort Ticonderoga and bring them to Boston to help fight against General Gage's British regular troops. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold are successful in taking the fort and in taking the cannons, but they do not arrive in Boston in time for the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, actually, the battle takes place on Breed's Hill. This is a mistaken name, but everyone remembers it as Bunker Hill. Breed's Hill, or Bunker Hill if you want to look at it, was a hill that overlooked Boston Harbor. And remember, the British are occupying the city. So it is the British Navy that is in Boston Harbor. American militia forces, so technically civilian forces, take control of the hill. And General Gage is worried that they would be able to fire down on the British Navy. So the general in charge of the troops at the time, his name is General Howe, H-O-W-E, he decides to send his forces up the hill, 2,400 British soldiers going up a hill against some American militiamen. The militiamen are low on ammunition to start with. They do have the advantage in terms of territory and tactical advantage, but they're running low on ammunition. So the American commander of the militia gives the order, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. They had to make each bullet count. And we saw this cartoon in class of Charles Bug-Eyed Bingham. Ultimately, the Americans do have to retreat, but it is an incredibly costly victory for the British. And the Americans learn a few lessons. They learn that they are not very skilled at hand-to-hand combat, because once the British do make it over the crest of the hill, they're going to fight with their bayonets. So the Americans learn their skills in war aren't the best, especially compared to the British. The other thing the Americans learn is how important it is to maintain a supply line, to have the ammunition that you need in order to be successful. Again, the British do consider this a victory, but they lose quite a number of soldiers, and it is a sign to the British that these colonists might actually fight back. They won't submit to British authority. Because of this, General Thomas Gage decides that the Loyalists living in Boston should evacuate. And so the British decide to evacuate, and they are going to use these brothers, General Howe, who is at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and his brother, Admiral Howe. And they are going to be in charge of organizing this mass evacuation. They're hoping that the Loyalists in the North would help them sort of turn the tide of convincing the American colonists, convincing the Patriots to stay united with Britain. That was not the case. And they have learned from their time in Boston with Lexington and Concord, with now the Battle of Bunker Hill, that this is not the best place to go. So General and Admiral Howe take the British Army, as well as any loyalist civilians, and they take them up to Canada for safekeeping. Their goal is to sort of regroup, stay fit, keep training, and eventually re-attack in the mid-Atlantic colonies and eventually in the South. Around this time, January of 1776, a pamphlet is produced. It's called Common Sense, and it's written by a man called Thomas Paine. He had just come to America in 1774, and he was an English citizen. And when he comes to America, he sort of looks at the relationship between the American colonies and the British. And the conclusion he comes to is really that Britain, if they're using the analogy of sort of a parent relationship, that Britain has been a very bad parent. If they are a mother country, a mother would not treat their children with this type of abuse that America has been subject to. And in this pamphlet, it is printed widely throughout the colonies, and because most Americans at the time were literate, they were able to read these ideas. And Thomas Paine says that it really is absurd that an island on the other side of the ocean should be able to rule over an entire continent. And so with his pamphlet, I mean, over 120,000 sold in 3 months. This is something that almost all Americans read, and they start to share opinions, and we start moving from the idea of possibly, we have a disagreement with Britain, but we would like to repair and maintain our relationship with the mother country. Now, more and more civilians are catching on to the idea of independence, that maybe we cannot fix the situation. Maybe our relationship is beyond repair, and maybe it's time for independence. So it was really essential that Thomas Paine spreads these ideas to the civilian population. And it sort of is the prequel to what will happen later that summer with the Declaration of Independence, or its official title, the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States. The Second Continental Congress chooses 5 individuals to create this document: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And Thomas Jefferson uses his knowledge of the Enlightenment, he uses his understanding of politics, and he creates these ideas that are now so part of our culture, that rights endowed by the Creator, and this sort of is that deist idea of a creator, that those rights are more important, are given greater value than any rights given by the English government. He also adds in other Enlightenment rights, other Enlightenment ideas like those of Rousseau, that it is the consent of the governed that must be present. And of course, John Locke's idea of natural rights. And so these ideas are put into this document. Congress decides on July 2nd that they will accept this Declaration of Independence, but it is not ratified, it's not solidified until July 4th, 1776. Again, these aren't brand new ideas, but it's the way in which they are phrased that is putting voice to these frustrations that the Americans had against the British. And it really is an indictment. The preamble is possibly the very famous part about we hold these truths to be self-evident, but then it goes through sort of a count by count of crimes that the government, specifically King George III, have committed against these people, and why legally they should be able to be independent. But now this raises the question, if the American colonies are going to be independent, what about people in those colonies who don't necessarily want independence, like the Loyalists? This was a huge question because there were possibly 150, 200,000 people who considered themselves Loyalists. And for them, this was really about maintaining their oath to the king. Often Loyalists were more well-to-do, or down in the South, they were wealthy plantation owners. And so this is going to be a tricky situation, is what are we going to do with all these people who don't want to break away from the British Empire? For slaves, the British are going to use slaves as a resource. They look at the slaves and realize these people are they're owned by these American colonists. So the British offer freedom in return for joining the British Army. So there are many slaves who join the British Army in hoping for their freedom. Those who are free blacks, they see the revolution as a chance to sort of leverage this talk of freedom into more rights, more active involvement in civil society. For the slaves who do join the British Army, most of them are not in combat roles, but this was a very smart move by the British. Then we had Indians. Colonists who had been wanting to push past that proclamation line of 1763, they were hoping for Indian neutrality. And the British are hoping to get the Indians on their side, saying, if you support Britain, we'll be able to control the colonists, prevent them from getting into your territory. And the Indians, they are going to side primarily with the British over this issue of territory. Going further into 1776, we have the Battle of New York. And sometimes it's called the Battle of Long Island, sometimes it's called the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. They're all referring to the same battle. So you can see here in the middle of this map, there is Manhattan. On the right side of the map is Long Island, the specific part of Brooklyn. And the issue was, remember when the Howe brothers, General Howe and Admiral Howe, when they left Boston in 1775, their purpose was to regroup and come back and attack the mid-Atlantic. Washington was pretty much expecting this, so he had been preparing. But what is going to make things complicated is that the British are going to use another set of troops besides just the British regulars. They're going to use mercenaries called Hessians. These were soldiers from German territories who have been hired. They are professional soldiers. For the Americans, this was a huge insult, because this is, to them, is sort of an internal family matter between the British government and British subjects. And so for the British to start shipping in foreigners to fight this war is incredibly offensive to the Americans. Washington knows that the Royal Navy will be heading back to this area, so Washington builds a series of forts in Brooklyn and hopes he'll be able to prevent the British from being able to get up the East River. But the British Navy is, if you remember, considerable in terms of size and strength. So the British Navy is just kind of waiting there off of Staten Island. The British Army is incredibly huge, so this is another disadvantage that Washington and the American troops have. In the summer of 1776, in August, the British decide to land, and they are going to at least intend to circle around the Americans and entrap them. The problem is this was mostly open territory, and the British are going to take their time and dig trenches to protect themselves. And this was a lesson that they learned from the Battle of Bunker Hill. They charged up a hill across open territory, and that was part of the reason they had so many losses. So they're going to take their time here in Brooklyn, but that is going to give the Americans time to retreat. Now, while we generally think of as a retreat as a sort of cowardly action, in this case it was necessary. The British were more than twice the size of the Americans, and there were a few skirmishes, but George Washington decides it is worth retreating in order to be able to fight another day. He plans for this retreat to happen in the dead of night, and then we read the story in Under God about how in the morning, when the sun came up, there was a strange occurrence of fog. And then as soon as the last soldier made it across, the fog lifted. And we would look at this as providence, as sort of a miracle from God, giving the Americans a little bit more time, a little bit more of an advantage. Again, like Bunker Hill, this technically would be considered a British victory. But because the American army is able to escape, it means they're able to survive that much longer and fight the British at a later date. Then that brings us to here we have Washington crossing the Delaware. This would have happened on Christmas Day, 1776, crossing the Delaware over to Trenton. So the Battle of Trenton. This was a camp where Hessians were, remember these German mercenaries. It was Christmas, they'd been opening presents, they'd been drinking all day, and they were drunk as skunks. And Washington is going to use this to his advantage because it's the dead of winter. Traditionally, in this traditional warfare, you did not fight during the winter. But Washington sees this as an opportunity to sort of inflict some harm, inflict damage on the other side. And he is able to get nearly 1,000 Hessian troops to surrender right away. So for the Americans, this tactically, this wasn't about capturing anything or capturing a hill or anything like that. But the thing that's most important is that it's a morale boost. This is at Christmas. A week later, all of these soldiers who had enlisted, their enlistment would be up. It would be expired. And with the morale boost at Trenton, this is going to inspire these soldiers to sign up for another year of service. So perhaps without this victory, there wouldn't have been an army anymore because they all would have gone home. Then about a week later, we have the battle at Princeton. The British were sort of ready to settle for the winter, and Washington wanted to have sort of one last effort. Again, the British were not expecting to fight. So we have General Cornwallis, who is near the town of Princeton, New Jersey. British have 9,000 troops. The Americans have 6,000 troops. Again, Washington is outnumbered. And what he does is he has the Americans sort of keep some fires burning at night to make it seem like the Americans have not moved their position. Well, in fact, the Americans have tried to sort of outflank or encircle the British. Outnumbered, they still win. And again, this gives hope to the American civilians and to those American soldiers and inspire them to sign up for one more year. And at this point, this is when the American army decides to pause and winter, as it's called, make camp for the winter. That then takes us to the year 1777. The major battle of that year is the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga is here again in what would today be upstate New York. The British General Johnny Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny, his goal, his plan was to cut the colonies in half. So sort of create a boundary between the New England colonies and the middle and southern colonies, a divide and conquer strategy. So General Burgoyne was going to bring 3 armies with him from Canada. But with an army that size, there's a lot of stuff that you need. So the supply line is necessary for supporting an army of this size. You need camp followers, meaning the wives, the cooks, the washerwomen. They're all going to be part of it. But then for Burgoyne himself, he had lots of luggage. He liked to have lots of outfits on hand. He liked a good glass of champagne. And so we have all of these people who are trying to get down to New York, but it is taking them forever. The British are unfamiliar with the American landscape, and the Americans are going to use this to their advantage. The Americans are going to use guerrilla tactics. They're going to not fight lining up on either side of a field. They're going to hide. They're going to use the landscape to their advantage. Now, General Burgoyne had requested some assistance from General Howe, who was in New York. But the problem is, by the time the message got to New York, General Howe had already left. So now General Burgoyne is on his own. He is stuck in the woods of upstate New York. And he's kind of on his own. At this time, the Americans are going to come in and take advantage of the British in this situation. The generals for the Americans, we have General Gates, who is known as Granny Gates because he was very conservative and old-fashioned, and he is going to be assisted by Benedict Arnold. Pretty soon after fighting begins, General Burgoyne surrenders. He realizes he's outnumbered, he has no hope, and this was a huge deal because to have the British finally give up at this battle is going to be a boost for the Americans. But also, it's a lesson for the British that you can't be that far from the Navy and still be successful, that the British Navy is incredibly important. And then ultimately, once our French allies learn of this victory at Saratoga, they sign on the dotted line. They officially agree to join our alliance and to support us, not just sort of through the back channels, but financially and by sending troops. In the winter of 1777, a few things happen. The Americans are going to settle at Valley Forge. This is just outside Philadelphia, and the British had taken Philadelphia in 1777. This was where General Howe was on his way to when he missed the message from General Burgoyne. When the British are in Philadelphia, they get lazy. They are down for the season, and they get used to going to parties, going to balls. They're not training. At Valley Forge, where the Americans were, supplies were low, morale was low, but then this guy shows up, Baron von Steuben. He was a Prussian aristocrat. He was trained in the military, and he really, he wanted to help the Americans. So he comes to America and volunteers to work with the army, and he trains them. And we saw the video in class, sort of the montage of training, and he's taking really what was kind of just a bunch of militiamen, and he's turning them into a professional army. Another person who sort of joins the American cause at this time is Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette. He also volunteers to help with the American cause, but he doesn't want to train. He wants to fight. So we're starting to see support from other countries, specifically France, in our fight against the British. Now, the French become our allies because they do not like the British. But America had sent diplomats over to try and convince them. They had sent John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And as we saw in the video in class, they have two very different approaches to how to gain French support. Ultimately, we do get that alliance in part because of the victory at Saratoga. Another reason France is going to join us, not only do they dislike the British, but they're hoping they can gain back some territory that they lost during the French and Indian War. And the French will be really essential in terms of naval support because America really didn't have a navy at this time. As this alliance has been formed and solidified, Britain now is realizing that America is going to fight and America has other friends. Britain says, hey, how about we go back to your original demands from, like 1774. So we'll get rid of the taxes, we'll go back to sort of 1763 conditions. And the Americans say, it's too little, too late. With this, the British realize that Philadelphia tactically is probably not a great location. It's not very easy to defend. So the British, after their lazy winter, decide to evacuate Philadelphia. The Americans take it back once again. And Benedict Arnold is made the military governor. He was injured at the Battle of Saratoga, but he was hoping to receive a generalship to have a high command. This is what he gets. He's a bit bummed about it. We'll see what he does with that disappointment. Then we have the Battle of Monmouth. This is in New Jersey. As the British are leaving Philadelphia through New Jersey to get to New York, They meet up with the Americans with General Lee of the Continental Army. And General Washington had given him the order to attack the British. General Lee did not take advantage of it. And this was the general that received a higher command than Benedict Arnold. So for Benedict Arnold, this was sort of sweet justice. In terms of warfare, this really is the last major battle in the North. From here on out, the battles will take place in other locations. Then we have the Battle of Rhode Island. It takes place off the coast of Rhode Island. This is an engagement mostly between the British Navy and the French Navy. It's not terribly conclusive, but it was essential that the French were there to help the Americans in this case.